Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about narrative techniques. Now you all know how to identify omniscient narration and say first-person narration. That's pretty easy. Now what's a little bit trickier is what's called free indirect speech and stream of consciousness. Now, narrative techniques, the study of them is called narratology, right? So you can actually use narratological perspective in your essays and commentaries on a particular text, right? It can be used for your whole commentary or for a part of it, right? So it's interesting to not just study the contents of a text, but also the way the story is told. This study of how the events are narrated or how things are said is what is going to interest us today. Now, I'll start with stream of consciousness. Now, it's a term that was invented by William James at the end of the 19th century, in 1890. He was a psychologist, and he described what he called mind stuff, the way we think, as a stream, a flowing stream of sometimes not associated thoughts, and he said that we don't experience them as chopped up in bits, but just as a constant flow of experience. A kind of amalgam of images and thoughts interlaced seamlessly. Then it was used in a literary context in 1918 in a review about the author Dorothy Richardson and her novel Pilgrimage. Well, it's a series of novels. So it gradually became the accepted expression used to describe this kind of writing. Now, stream of consciousness is pretty easy to identify. It's easier than free indirect speech. So it's speech that is in the first person, and you get a sensation, the sensation that you're in the character's head, right? So it's usually quite fragmented. You might get, 3 dots or dashes, or just no punctuation at all, and just a series of juxtaposed images, sentence fragments. The syntax can be quite choppy. Sometimes even the spelling can be non-standard. So there really is an attempt to capture the way we think. We tend to think in non-linear ways. We just don't think in constructed sentences, as you've no doubt remarked. And we tend to think in images as well. I had a friend who used to say that he thought only in words and well-constructed sentences, but it seems a little bit unlikely. But I'm sure some people speak or think in more constructed ways than others, perhaps. But I think most people tend to think in images, as we probably did before we acquired language a long time ago. And sentence fragments or word fragments. So I definitely think that images and words are interlaced when we think. Now, one of the first practitioners of this was James Joyce, as you know, and he borrowed it from a novel called Les Lauriers sont coupés by Édouard Dujardin, a relatively minor novelist of the 19th century, but who nonetheless invented this technique. So you could say it's a bit like Picasso, who borrowed Cubism from Georges Braque. Joyce borrowed this from Edouard Dujardin, and became more famous than Dujardin because he was more inventive and skilled as a writer. So I'll give you an example of this. The most famous example of stream of consciousness is found at the end of his novel Ulysses. It's the part called Penelope. You know that Ulysses is based on the ancient Greek story, and so the last chapter is called Penelope, and it's Molly Bloom, one of the heroes, his wife, and she's lying down next to her husband and thinking back to their youth. And so I'll just give you an example of this, and I'll just call in James Joyce to recite it for us. He's here just to tell us a little bit about his last work, to recite it to us. Okay, so hi there, I'm James Joyce from Dublin. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to try and remember the end of my my passage there on Penelope. So I'll just, let me think now. Okay, here it is. Oh, that awful deep down torrent, oh, and the sea crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, and the fig trees in the Alameda gardens, yes, and all the queer little streets, and pink and blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens, and the jessamine, and geraniums, and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain, yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used. And shall I wear a red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. So there you see, that was the end of my Ulysses. And so I'm going to bring you back to Eric here, who's going to talk a little bit about stream of consciousness. I tended to call it interior monologue, but I'm fine with stream of consciousness as well. So cheerio, see you. So there's the end of Ulysses. Now, as you can see, it was very fragmented. So that was a 4,391 word monologue in that chapter. There are no commas, no punctuation whatsoever. The only punctuation mark was the final full stop in that interior monologue. So it's narration that plays wild, that kind of wreaks havoc with traditional narration and the rules of grammar and syntax. Now, so you could call it a kind of psycho-narration. It really gives you direct access in the present tense with the first person singular to a character's thoughts, feelings, impressions, and it uses associative leaps, right? So free association, that's the way we tend to think, right? Something triggers a memory, for example, and then there's just that we leap back and forwards through time, and so that really captures that kind of flow of our thoughts. Now, in interior monologue, there are often references to the here and now of the character, right? So deictic words, here, there, and so on. Words that refer to the character's lived present. That is a strong tendency. You often have exclamation marks, question marks, to show a mind at work. Now that's so interior monologue is also called a quoted stream of consciousness, where you really get the direct access to the character's thoughts and feelings and sensations. What then is called free and direct style is also called narrated stream of consciousness. So we're still in the character's head with narrated stream of consciousness, which I think I'll refer to as free and direct speech or free and direct discourse from now on. So it's free and direct discourse is a form of narration that is quite similar to omniscient narration in that it uses the third person singular, right? So he or she. And the only major difference is that it does away with these tags or tag phrases like she thought, he wondered, etc., and that kind of orienting sort of tag, right? That makes shows you, indicates to the reader very clearly that these are thoughts, right? So it does. Free and direct discourse gets rid of those, so that you're left with very little mediation. There is very little narratorial intrusion, as it were. Of course, there is the author writing it, but let's say that you don't feel the author writing it. You feel you're directly in the character's mind, even though it's in the past tense, right, which is the grammar of omniscient narration. Now, how do you recognize free and direct speech? Well, you know how to distinguish it from stream of consciousness, since stream of consciousness uses the first person narrative. Now, how do you distinguish it from omniscient narration? Now, the major way to distinguish it from omniscient narration is that, you don't have this strong mediation, and above all, you have the vocabulary of the character. That is probably the easiest way to distinguish omniscient narration from free and direct speech, right? So you do get the things like colloquialisms that traditionally, at least, an omniscient narrator doesn't use. There was a tendency, even in some modernists, not to use slang or colloquial language in the omniscient narration, right? So that's a pretty easy way to identify free and direct speech. You have words that an omniscient narrator wouldn't use, traditionally at least. You also have a lot of exclamation marks and question marks. You can have pauses, three dots. You might have indented passages. These are also used in stream of consciousness. You might have also, the use of abridgment. He's instead of he is, for example, right? So you feel that it's more spoken language. Now the tricky thing, though, once that is said, is that authors who use free and direct speech often interlace it with other forms of narrative. So you might have a passage, even within the same paragraph, that starts off like a pretty traditional omniscient narration, and then in the next sentence moves on to free indirect speech, and then back again. So I would be wary of saying, that, like, for example, as some people say, that, Ulysses is all written in stream of consciousness, right? It's not at all the case. We tend to associate James Joyce with stream of consciousness, rightly, but the novel is not at all written entirely in stream of consciousness, which would be tedious after a while. You would get sick of being in someone's head all the time, and in that sort of very loose, very rambling sort of way. You would get sick of a whole novel. Even the 40 pages of Molly Bloom's monologue at the end, require a lot of concentration, even though the language is very inventive, so you don't get bored, but a whole novel would be too much. Right, so I think I've made that clear. Now, so ultimately, free indirect discourse is what you would call colored narrative. It's colored by a character's speech, right, the way he or she speaks, but also their ideology, also their obsessions, their thoughts, right? So you clearly are in the presence of the character's mind. Now, some theorists have evoked the possibility of what they call a dual voice, and they call this the dual voice hypothesis. And they argued that free indirect speech is actually a combination of both the author's language and the character's language. Now, this depends really on the author. There are some authors who might limit their free indirect speech only to the vocabulary that particular character would be able to master, or the type of vocabulary that they would use. And other writers, like, say, Gustave Flaubert, for example, he gives Madame Bovary his own perceptions as well, his own vocabulary as well. So I think the dual voice hypothesis works well as a theory to analyze Madame Bovary, because he expanded her relatively limited viewpoint with his own perceptions, with his own vocabulary, so that it wouldn't be drab, and so that he would feel free to intermix his own thoughts and perceptions with hers. So there is a kind of dovetailing, of the author and the character in free indirect speech. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between the author's thoughts, the author's ideology, and the character's ideology. Right? You sometimes think, who is this? Is this the author saying this, or is this the character? To what extent does the author believe what the character is thinking? Right. So there is a certain ambiguity to free indirect speech, and it's an ambiguity that the authors want. They want you to feel that they have fused with their character, at least momentarily. So it's a way of inhabiting a way for the author to inhabit the character's frame of mind, by becoming their character, essentially. Right. So just to make it absolutely clear, so direct discourse is when something like he said, "I need you," right? Or I need her. Now, indirect discourse then is when you find things like he said he needed her. Right? It's in the past tense. It's kind of reported speech. And then free indirect speech is he needed her. Right? So you see the difference? Okay. Right. So I think that more or less wraps it up. Yes. Okay. So I'll just give you two more examples, so to make it even clearer. Now the first is from The Sound and the Fury. That's one of the most famous examples of stream of consciousness. Now he, in this opening passage, it's Benji, who is a half-wit, and he's the narrator. So it's a good example of an unreliable narrator, since he doesn't really understand what he sees. He describes it in very childlike terms. So this first description is a description of two people playing golf. But the word golf is never used because Benji doesn't understand what golf is. Right? He thinks it's just people hitting a ball. Which it is really, but he doesn't understand why they're doing it. Through the fence, between the curling flower spaces, I could see them hitting. They were coming towards where the flag was, and I went along the fence. Luster was hunting in the grass by the flower tree. They took the flag out, and they were hitting. Then they put the flag back and they went to the table, and he hit and the other hit. When they went on and I went along the fence, Luster came away from the flower tree and we went along the fence, and they stopped and we stopped, and I looked through the fence where Luster was hunting in the grass. Here, Caddy, he hit. They went away across the pasture. I held to the fence and watched them going away. Listen at you now, Luster said. Ain't you something, 33 years old, going on that way, after I done went all the way to town to buy you that cake? Hush up, that moaning. Ain't you going to help me find that quarter so I can go to the show tonight? They were hitting little across the pasture. I went back along the fence to where the flag was. It flapped on the bright grass and the trees. Right, so you see what he calls the flower tree, right, which is quite evocative. So you have some poetry that comes from this simple mind evoking a tree in flower, right? He sees it as a combination between a tree and a flower, right, the flower tree. Right, so here you see there's nothing, the vocabulary is very simple. It's limited to the kind of vocabulary that Benji would have, and the kind of perceptions that he would have. Now I'm going to give you an example, a more complex example. That's pretty straightforward stream of consciousness. And here now is an example from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Right, you remember Virginia Woolf? Yeah. Hi. It's from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which starts off in indirect speech. Right? Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And then in the next sentence it moves to free indirect speech, right? Without the tag she thought. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. Right? That's Mrs. Dalloway thinking about Lucy. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Roppelmayer's men were coming, and then, thought Clarissa Dalloway. Right? So she does sometimes put in the tags. So you have free indirect speech with the tag, right? So to facilitate it. That's something that James Joyce doesn't do. He doesn't facilitate it for the reader. Sometimes Virginia Woolf does add these more traditional tags. So, and then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. Right? So, now the next part, you could say, is either free indirect speech or stream of consciousness, since in the first part you don't get a verbal tense. What a lark, what a plunge. And then you know it's free indirect speech because you have a verb in the past tense. For so it had always seemed to her, when with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiffer than this, of course. The air was in the early morning. Right, so very clearly, we're in the past, right? She's remembering what it was like to be a child on the beach, right? And that free association was triggered by the mention of children on a beach, right? So we swing into the past. It's not said Clarissa Dalloway remembered what it was like as a child, right? There's just a paragraph break and we're straight into her reminiscence. Thank you.